So as you know, this is one in the series of IDS members seminars where members of staff present their current research to staff and students. And today I'm going to be presenting a strand of work that has been ongoing for about 5 years, and is going to focus on some new publications on digital surveillance in Africa, including this book that just came out 2 weeks ago. And we've got two presenters online, one Gifty Appiah-Adjei from Ghana and Judy Gitahi from Kenya. But before I introduce them, I just want to make some background contextual comments. So, as I said, this research is part of a strand of research that's been going on for the last 5 years and started with this publication on the left. We'd originally applied to do some networking grant where we brought together 10 researchers from 10 different African countries. But as soon as the money arrived, the pandemic started and no one was allowed to meet. So we gave the money to the 10 researchers in 10 different countries to scope out what they thought the most important digital rights issues were in their country. And that was published in 2021. And top of the list was the use of digital surveillance by the state. And that then became a theme of our work. We followed up by an analysis of surveillance law in 6 different countries. And then last year, we produced a mapping of which companies from which countries were supplying which digital surveillance technologies to African governments. And that scoping study was the most comprehensive documentation of digital surveillance in those 5 countries. And it became the raw material, the data, for the chapters in this book. So both Gifty and Judy were involved both in the mapping and then later using forms of power analysis to analyze the data that they found in their countries. And that's the work that we're going to be talking about. And for those who are new to the term, all we mean by digital rights is using human rights as a framework for assessing the use of technology in social, economic, and political life. And we also, 2 weeks ago, published this short guide to understanding digital rights. So all of this work is carried out by the African Digital Rights Network. The African Digital Rights Network is a virtual association of 75 African scholars of digital rights, and is hosted here at IDS. And that means we've been able to publish this series of reports and a series of books on aspects of digital rights so far in 30 different African countries. Okay, so moving on. As I mentioned, in addition to those documentary reports, which are published on IDS Open Docs, we also have a book series with Z Books. So this is a series of books, again, on different aspects of digital rights. We're up to the 5th one. We've finished book 5, and we've got money now for book 7 and 8. So it's become an ongoing series, and typically each book will have about 10 chapters by at least 10 different African scholars from at least 10 different African countries on whatever it says on the front of the book. So we have 2 main strands of research: the positive stuff, like the creative use of digital technology to expand agency, rights, and digital citizenship. So that's the citizenship strand. And the bad stuff, the strand of digital authoritarianism, the negative use of digital technologies to repress citizen agency, rights, and citizenship. And today we're going to be talking about the orange third book on the right, Digital Surveillance in Africa. And Gifty and Judy are going to be presenting their studies from the two countries. So normally, at least at the beginning, 5 years ago, when we started talking about digital surveillance in international development, people were a little bit understandably skeptical and were, Tony, why should we be prioritizing the study of surveillance in international development? Why are you always focused on the negative stuff? And that original scoping study had highlighted digital surveillance primarily because of the Cambridge Analytica scandal and the Snowden revelations. So we, in the UK, we think of Cambridge Analytica as being a British social media surveillance company that foreign governments bought consultancy from to influence elections in other countries and Brexit in the UK. But Cambridge Analytica had been working in Kenya and Nigeria before it worked on the Brexit campaign or on Trump 2016. And then the Snowden revelations exposed the fact that the governments of the United States and the governments of the United Kingdom had for many years been systematically surveilling all of its own citizens as well as foreign citizens. And part of the Snowden revelations talked about the British government's collusion with the South African government to intercept the internet cables going into Cape Town in order to conduct surveillance on South African citizens. So those two big stories made surveillance a global front page story and alerted the researchers in the first study. But since then, there's hardly a week or month that goes by without a new surveillance story, often very specifically in international development or humanitarian work. So you'll remember the stories about the United Nations sharing the data they'd collected about Rohingya refugees with the Myanmar government in the context of genocide, and of Meta sharing data that supported ethnic cleansing and genocide in Myanmar. And more recently, we've seen how the government in Israel has been using many different forms of surveillance, including facial recognition, mobile phone, spyware, and pager explosives to persecute Palestinians in Gaza and Lebanon. So the connections between the use of surveillance technology and the goals and aims of international development had already started to overlap quite a lot. And now we're faced with the US government using surveillance technology to stop people at borders, to disappear them, to snatch students off of campuses, and to take people into custody and send them to jails in El Salvador. It's like, now it's not every month there's a new story, now it's every day there's a new horrendous story about state use of surveillance technology to repress human rights and people's development understood as freedoms. But none of these stories that I've mentioned are about Africa, and Africa has been systematically underrepresented both in the news coverage and in the academic literature when it comes to data on surveillance and development. And that was one of the reasons that we pursued this stream of research and commissioned these new studies that Gifty and Judy are going to talk to us about today. So we commissioned actually a larger number of researchers initially to conduct this research. But in some of the countries that we wanted to conduct the research in, for ethical reasons, we couldn't go forward with the research. So in North African countries, including Egypt and Sudan, in Ethiopia and Zimbabwe, it wasn't possible for researchers from that country to write in their own name about their state surveillance without it representing a safety issue for them or their families. So actually, the book is about the countries where there's more scope to talk about these things and not some of the most oppressive and authoritarian countries. So we're continuing this research beyond the publications I've spoken about here. And we've just started a new piece of research on both on biometric digital ID, which you can see here, and on SAFE, which is public space surveillance using facial recognition technology. And in that research, we have found a way ethically and safely to include North African countries, Ethiopia and Zimbabwe. So I've been talking for too long already. And so I'd like to introduce you to two of the researchers who worked on this project, Judy Gitahi, who was an IDS master's student here a few years ago, now works for Laterite Research in Kenya, and Dr. Appiah-Adjei from the University of Winneba in Ghana. So Judy, if you're hearing us and you're ready to begin, I'd like to hand the floor over to you to talk for the next 15 minutes on your research in Kenya.
Okay, thanks, Tony, for the introduction, and hi, everyone. My name is Judy. As mentioned, I was a MA Dev student at IDS. I really enjoyed the member seminar, so it's really exciting to be back as a speaker. Yeah, so I worked on this chapter alongside my co-author, Muthuri Kathura, who is a lawyer and digital rights activist in Kenya. And Kenya is a really interesting case study because it has a relatively open civil society, and citizens are really willing to challenge government outreach vocally. And this democratic openness means there's a lot of discourse on either problematic surveillance practices. There's a lot of a public record of state actions and also public resistance through the courts, through online activism towards digital surveillance acquisition. And I'll also talk a bit about Kenya as a country where the courts have proven that surveillance, when it gets into the wrong hands, can lead to violations of constitutional rights. But I think to start us off, surveillance in Kenya, like to give some context, it goes back to the colonial period. Surveillance to the British colonial administration, although not digital, surveillance was established in this time to monitor uprising and from the Mau Mau in the 50s. And following independence, these surveillance systems were used by the post-colonial government, but then they were more targeted towards political opposition in the second half of the century. During Moi's presidency, that's up to 2002, that's when surveillance capabilities really underwent significant expansion. So the Directorate of Security Intelligence was formed, and this was used to systematically monitor academics, journalists, and civil society activists who were anti-government. And then in the 2000s, once with the advent of digital technology, the sort of surveillance space has evolved to include more digital ways of surveillance. And these methodologies have evolved in response to security challenges in Kenya, particularly the threat of Al-Shabaab terrorism and post-election violence in 2007 and 2008, which are key reasons that the government gives for upscaling its surveillance capability. And so I'll talk about sort of the surveillance landscape now. And the book chapters mapped the surveillance technologies that have been acquired across 5 categories. And across all 5 categories, we found evidence from our desk research that either state agencies or private companies have acquired technologies that enable them to surveil. So under internet interception, these are technologies that are used to surveil, censor, or manipulate internet traffic. In 2017, Safaricom, which is the largest telecoms company in Kenya, acquired in-network infrastructure that would enable them to protect the network, but also gives them capability to surveil, censor, and manipulate internet traffic. Under mobile interception, these are technologies that intercept mobile calls and so on. A report from Privacy International in 2017 showed that the NIS, the National Intelligence Service, had been using this technology since 2007 to simulate cell towers, intercept private communication, and even track citizens' locations with precision. And even more recently, in 2023, the Communications Authority of Kenya, who govern communications in the country, were given approval to acquire a system that would enable them to access all mobile subscriber devices. And the reason for this was given as a way of being able to detect counterfeit phones, but it also gives the capability to be able to intercept all mobile phones in the country. Under social media monitoring, I think the most common example is Cambridge Analytica, who were a political consultant in prior elections, and they were hired to analyze social media behavior and use that information to influence voting. For safe smart city surveillance, this is a common form of surveillance in a lot of African countries, mainly funded by Chinese companies and government. So in Kenya, there's a city called Konza that integrates thousands of CCTV cameras with facial recognition, and it gives the ability to monitor citizen movements across the city. And finally, in the last category that we mapped, this was biometric and digital ID surveillance technology. These are technologies where biometrics are taken and then they're used to either access government services. And in Kenya, there was a rollout of a Huduma number, which was a biometric system that would collect fingerprints and personal identifying data of all Kenyans, and that information would be integrated into a system, and you'd need to use your biometrics to access virtually any government service. And similarly, following the Huduma number, there have also been reports that there'll be a unique personal identifier where that will enable digital tracking of all citizens from childhood up until adulthood. And these are just a couple of examples of the soft technologies across the 5 categories that we found in the reports that we reviewed, that either government agencies or the government themselves have acquired. And so when we look at the different categories in isolation, I think it's really easy to conclude that each of these serve a legitimate security purpose with very minimal human rights implications. So internet interception could be used to target criminal communications, and same for mobile interception technology. Social media monitoring enables identifying incitement, and smart city technology reduces crime in large cities. And biometric systems in a lot of countries could streamline service delivery and make it easier for people to access services. But when we look at all these technologies together, when these very disparate surveillance methodologies are integrated into one comprehensive system, our chapter argues that this gives the government a panoptic power to surveil citizens at mass. And so we chose this concept of panoptic power, so the coercive power of either states to cause citizens to change their behavior since they feel that they're being watched, to analyze Kenya, because the different surveillance technologies in isolation may not really have human rights implications, but when put together into a comprehensive system, citizens might feel urged to change their behavior or to self-regulate because there's this constant fear that the government is watching you. And we have found some empirical evidence of sort of this behavior change. Examples are like journalists abandoning reporting about certain political topics because they reported that their colleagues had started being surveilled or felt that their mobile interception or their internet activity was being surveilled. In the case of Huduma Number, which is this biometric ID system, there was a lot of pushback from citizens towards registering for it because there were concerns about how data was being used, and there was a lot of collective resistance against the heightened state surveillance capability that would emerge if the government had all this data from the biometric ID system. And in the case of the Huduma Number, this led to a really significant judicial intervention. So a group of civil society organizations, including the Kenyan Human Rights Commission and the Kenya National Commission on Human Rights, they presented a case to the High Court where they requested for the halting of the Huduma Number rollout because there weren't enough data protection measures in place that would guarantee that the data that was being collected was not going to fall in the wrong hands and be used for surveillance. And in a landmark sort of ruling, the High Court halted the rollout of Huduma Number, and they cited some of the concerns that had come up from the resistance and from activists online. So one, the right to privacy was being violated because there weren't enough sort of safeguards on how data was being collected and how it would be processed. The court also ruled that the Huduma Number had potential to further exclude certain communities who are already excluded from either accessing IDs, and there weren't enough measures on how rolling out Huduma Number would reduce their exclusion. And then I think finally and most significantly, the court ruled that this harmonization and interlinking of all these databases and having one database with all your data that you'd need to access any government service created the possibility of mass surveillance. And this could enable comprehensive monitoring of citizens' interactions with government services and potentially lead to misuse of surveillance. And this decision established a really important precedent. And I think the lesson here is that national security and administrative efficiency can be justifications for surveillance technology acquisition, but they must still operate within constitutional parameters to respect fundamental rights and protection. I think we ended our chapter with sort of giving some recommendations and thinking about the gaps in the current surveillance landscape in Kenya. One key gap is the Data Protection Act does not really define what a national security justification means and to what extent state actors can use national security as a justification for acquiring technology that gives them capability to surveil citizens. And this is related to the lack of an independent oversight body that can sort of limit who acquires technologies, how they acquire it, how they acquire the technology, and how they use them. And finally, there's a significant influence of foreign entities in these technology acquisitions. China is a key funder of smart city CCTV technology. The Huduma Number was funded partly by Estonia, and a number of the other technologies acquired in Kenya have been funded by foreign bodies, and there aren't enough regulations on how digital sovereignty and potential technological colonialism if most surveillance technology acquisitions are being funded by foreign bodies. And so we concluded our chapter with giving those exact recommendations, the need for more independent regulatory authority, a deeper review of data protection frameworks, and more explicit provisions on surveillance technology, and also having more public participation when acquiring technology. And finally, while there might be legitimate security concerns that warrant governments or other entities to acquire technology, always sort of balancing security objectives with also transparency obligations and human rights, since these surveillance technologies could be used to mass surveil citizens. So I'll pause there and hand it back over to Tony.
Great, thank you, Judy. That was really useful and very clear. Does anyone have any questions that they want to put to Judy straight away, or can I just go give the floor to Gifty and do questions and answers at the end? Is that okay? Okay. Thank you, Judy. We're going to pass the floor over to Gifty. Gifty, you have a presentation, so do you want to take control of the screen?
All right. Thank you very much, Tony. And then good afternoon to everyone. Like Tony already indicated, I am Gifty, and I am here to share my study. Yeah, okay, it's our study because I have a co-author by name Wole Oladapo, but I am sharing this on our behalf. Now, let me kindly share my screen.
Okay, we're seeing your screen now.
Okay. All right, so our chapter is looking at power, resistance, and experiences of digital surveillance in Ghana. Now, governments in Ghana over the years have made huge investments in the acquisition of digital surveillance technologies, and these investments and acquisitions afford them the capability to mount illegal surveillance on citizens. So if you look at the Ghanaian context, we have the mobile interception technologies being used, we have multiple biometric identification systems, and of course, the smart city surveillance technologies are all being used in Ghana. And it is important to note that these technologies are being used in a context where when it comes to procurement of these technology, it is done in secrecy, and government agencies or national security officials have undefined power to mount surveillance on people because the existing legislature or statute supports them to mount surveillance on others. So the problem that our study sought to investigate had to do with the fact that there is evidence in literature that there is growing intolerance for voices that are critical of the government. And we also, in the midst of this, we have huge investments into digital technologies that is expanding the technologies surveillance technologies that are being used. And the funny thing is that empirical evidence of surveillance doesn't exist. We don't have such studies within the Ghanaian context. Therefore, our study was to try to find empirical evidence of surveillance, illegal surveillance in the country. So our study was guided by these three research questions. We first of all wanted to tap into the experiences, know the experiences of victims so far as rights-violating digital surveillance in Ghana is concerned. And then we will also try to find the architect behind these acts of surveillance and then the drivers for that act. And then finally, we were interested in knowing how they were resisting surveillance. So our study was underpinned by the Power Cube model, and we were interested in using it to show how surveillance is a form of power that is being used or that is operating within the Ghanaian context. So our study used a qualitative approach, and through a case study design and then purposive sampling, 5 participants were purposively selected, and these consist of journalists and human rights activists who were very critical of a government. So through face-to-face interviews, we gathered data from these selected participants, and then the data was thematically analyzed. Now, to our findings, with regard to research question 1, where we were interested in the experiences of victims of illegal surveillance in Ghana, we realized that the issue of bugging devices and then mounting surveillance on the phones of the study participants, this was the main theme that we derived from the data gathered. And we realized that, for instance, one participant indicated that he just had a call, an anonymous call, and he was told that he's been talking about certain issues and mentioning certain names, and the call is just to let him know that he's on the radar and he's being monitored. So until that time that he received that call, he was not even aware that he was being monitored. We also had another, we were also told of an instance where journalists and human rights activists who had been arrested by the police during a demonstration were detained and their phones were seized whilst they were in detention. But upon being released, they were their attention were drawn to the fact that even at the time that they were in detention, anytime anybody, any of their colleagues checked their social media handles, they realized that they were online. So that made them suspicious, because being in detention for, let's say, 4 days, definitely your battery is going to run out. So how can you be online whilst your battery is supposed to? And that made them suspicious. And they also checked their social media account, the settings of their social media accounts, as well as their calls and SMS. And they realized that their social media accounts have been linked to unknown devices, and then their numbers, their calls were being forwarded to unknown numbers. There was also an instance where one of the participants was a leader of a group that were planning demonstration against the government, and because they know that they were being they were mounting surveillance on them physically, they went online planning their meetings and all that. And they decided that since the time for the demonstration was drawing near, they were, as a form of security, they were moving their devices from their usual location to the new location, only for them to wake up the following morning and realize that that new location that they stored their devices had been broken into. And even though there were precious stuff over there, it was only their phones, their devices, hard drives. These were the things that were stolen. So you realize that these participants were victims of illegal surveillance based on these experiences that I've just recounted. And as a result of that, at the onset, when they realized that their phones were being bugged or their devices had been bugged, they were scared, and so they started censoring some of the information that they put out. Some even went off, like they are not even going to use a phone, talk, or do anything. And so you realize that by virtue of the fact that when you go into Power Cube literature, it indicates that when it comes to closed spaces, like for instance, policy spaces are often characterized as closed space. And so you realize that the policy of surveillance going on in Ghana, it's done in closed spaces. So the decision to bug and illegally mount surveillance on these participants were done in closed spaces. And as a result of that, you realize that it gives the national security operatives the power to violate the right of the study participants to their privacy, because by our statute, you cannot mount surveillance on anybody's device without court warrants. It's obvious that these participants were not into any illegal thing that there will be a need for the court to grant warrants for their phones to be monitored. But it was happening because these operatives were operating in closed spaces, and it gave them the power to do what they did. Now, with regards to the second research question, where we were interested in the architects behind the surveillance and then the motivations for that, all the participants anonymously indicated that they believe it's state actors who were behind their experiences. And when we probed for evidence, for instance, one participant indicated that having the call, that anonymous call, and the person indicating that he's on the radar of national security, so whenever he mentions certain topics or certain names, automatically they start recording his conversation. This is evidence to show that in his case, it was the state officials or actors who were behind the act. Other participants also made arguments that it is common knowledge that the government has acquired the Pegasus software. And so, considering the fact that these softwares are very expensive and it requires some kind of technical know-how to be able to use these technologies, it is obvious that it is the state, because it is the state that can afford and then purchase these technologies. And if definitely they are purchasing it, then it means that they have the technical staff that have the capacity to use that. One participant also made the argument that there has been no record of arrest when it comes to illegal use of these technologies, because it is illegal to do that. So far as no arrest has been made, yet they are victims of it. And it means that those who are supposed to make the arrest are the very ones doing it. That is why nobody has been arrested. And with regards to the motivation for state securities doing that, the participants through the interview data mentioned that they were doing this for information gathering purposes. That is to say that information is power. So the authorities know that they are very critical of them. So they are mounting surveillance in order to know what they are doing and be in a better position to stop them before they come out and do whatever they plan doing with maybe an investigative piece or a demonstration that they are about to carry out. And linked to this theme of information gathering, they also talked about the fact that because most of the time people in government are doing what is wrong, they fear that when they are exposed, they are going to lose face. So they want to always be on top of issues to prevent that from happening. And another issue that came up strongly was the issue of impunity. That is to say that the participants were of the view that because these officials were backed by statute, they know that they can do whatever, like they can mount the surveillance and get away with it. And so that the issue of impunity comes in over there, because they know that even if I do it, I will not be punished. And that is the reason why they were doing that. So you realize that looking at what the security officials were doing, you realize that they were using the hidden, when it comes to power cube literature, they were using the hidden form of power to have access to these people's data on their blind side, so that they will know whatever they are doing or whatever they plan doing. So you realize that the guise of national security clothes them with this hidden power that affords them the opportunity or emboldens them to do these things with impunity, knowing that they can do whatever they want to do without being held accountable. And our third research question was interested in strategies that these victims were employing to resist surveillance. And so from the data that we gathered through the interview, we realized that upon realization and then knowing that they are powerless, they now changed the manner in which they were using their devices by adapting certain strategies. And one of the strategies was employing digital security consciousness. Like from time to time, they will use *#002# to check if their phone is being bugged or not. And then others were also using Authenticator and then VPN, among others, to protect their devices from interference from these officials. And they also, some of them were also using the software to protect their devices. And 3 of the participants indicated that they frequently change their mobile number. So that is to say that they have numerous SIM cards, and whenever they are into a project that they have the suspicion that they are being monitored, they just swap and then use a new SIM card. And these new SIM cards are SIM cards that they made people that are not close to them use their, because now in Ghana, before you can get a SIM card, you have to use your Ghana card, and they are able to track. So he made people that are not really close to him, but knows and appreciates the fact that he's an investigative journalist. They use their Ghana cards to buy these SIM cards for him, so that they'll be using it. And when they swap, they will not connect them to that number. So that was one strategy that they were using. And the one participant who is an investigative journalist also indicated that when he's on anything sensitive, he always ensures that he meets his sources in person. So he doesn't want to leave digital footprint by using any, even though he knows that he's protecting his device, he doesn't want to take the risk. So he goes for in-person meetings with his sources. And others also indicated that they re-strategize or they go cold. So that is to say that if I'm on a project and I realize that I'm being monitored digitally, then I stop that project so that for a while I will not touch that project, just to throw them off their trail, or they will give up. Now, by looking at these strategies that the study participants outlined, you realize that it is in sync with the claimed space aspect or dimension of the power cube. That is to say that you realize that all of them have that kind of mindset that, hey, I'm being monitored, therefore I need to do something to protect myself from this. And as a result of that, they adapt these strategies. And as they adapt these strategies in their everyday activities or journalistic duties, they are creating a space that protects, that is for them. So it's more or less like they are reclaiming their privacy back from the state agency or officials that are mounting surveillance on them. So to conclude, our study established that there is empirical evidence of rights-violating digital surveillance going on in Ghana, and that state security agencies are the main culprits, and they do this just to know what these participants were investigating or researching on, in order to know when to stop them or know how to find a means to prevent them from carrying out whatever they were doing. And we also concluded that awareness of surveillance acts caused them to adapt strategies that enable them to resist these officials from monitoring their activities. And so, based on our findings, we concluded that there should be the need for more awareness and sensitization so far as the issue of rights-violating surveillance, digital surveillance in Ghana is concerned. And we also recommended that there should be transparency and accountability when it comes to the use of these technologies by state security agencies. And then finally, we also recommended that there should be that conscious effort to train journalists, human rights activists, political rights, these CSO activists who are very critical of the government. They should be trained on digital safety consciousness so that they are constantly monitoring their devices to prevent the state agencies from having access to their devices. Thank you, I'm done, and then I'll hand it over to Tony.
Thank you very much. So we have time for questions, and just to give you a minute to formulate your questions, I just want to say a couple of things about what we can see when we read across all of the chapters, what's common across the different territories. One of them has been mentioned already, and that is that these systems of state surveillance were introduced to Africa by colonial administration. So in Anglophone territories, the British colonial administration used the special branch of the police force to start spying on domestic populations, to serve its power, to retain power, and to repress anti-colonial uprisings Judy talked about the Mau Mau in Kenya. But then after liberation, new administrations retained those surveillance powers. They used them to defend their power interests and to repress people that they felt were threatening their power. And so surveillance has a long history, as long as the states have existed in most countries. But the digitalization of their capabilities has radically changed what is possible and what is practical. And that happens at two levels when you look across the evidence of these countries. One is that it makes possible mass surveillance. So analog surveillance with people sitting in a van with headphones on was quite expensive. It had to be targeted at a small number of high-profile targets. But digitalization of surveillance capabilities means that you can do dragnet surveillance, mass surveillance of everybody, and use artificial intelligence to listen out for keywords, as Gifty was saying. And when you hear a key word, that becomes a red flag to a human operative who then uses it to target a particular journalist or a particular citizen. So it's both the massification of surveillance that it makes possible, but also the micro-targeting of surveillance, where it can look for particular demographics in particular locations saying particular things and micro-target them for repression. Are there questions on the floor? Yes, please.
Thank you. Thank you both for the presentations. They were really interesting. I had a question for Dr. Appiah-Adjei. You mentioned the different participants who were targeted and were victims of the state surveillance. And I was wondering if you could say more about if there was any kind of patterns of what the activities were that the governments, the Ghanaian government in this case, was trying to stop. I understand that it's anything that would be against the government, but I don't know if you can say more about what kinds of activities and what kinds of things these journalists were investigating that was particularly putting their lives putting their activities at risk. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Per our data, we realized that 3 of the participants, they were targeted whilst they were planning demonstration against the government. So, you know, at a point in time, people were complaining about high standards of living and a whole lot. There were so many issues that people were not happy with. So pressure groups were carrying out demonstrations against government. So those that I interviewed, they were targeted because at that time they were planning a demonstration to criticize the government for poor management of the economy or for high standards of living and all that. But with one of the investigative journalists that I interviewed, as at the time that he was his device was bugged, he was not even he was carrying out this investigative piece, but even in his newsroom, it was only his editor that knew about that investigative project that he was embarking on. So it was only the 2 of them who were in the know. As to how they managed to get to know of that one, they couldn't establish. But his suspicion is that some way, somehow, they managed to know that he was embarking on that investigative piece, and that is the reason why he was bugged, because per the call, he was told that when he mentions certain topics or when he mentions certain names, automatically it picks that keyword, and so they now keep paying attention to whatever he's saying so far as the call that he's making is concerned. So yeah, basically this is what it is.
Thank you very much.
Other questions or comments?
Hi, both. Thanks so much for the wonderful presentations. I had a question for Judy. Obviously, digital tools played a massive role in the 2024 Finance Bill demonstrations. And of course, the movements were able to get a lot of concessions from the government. But are there any concerns that the government might sort of be preparing to be a little more retaliatory, especially around surveillance of who they might perceive as key perpetrators of or leaders of the movement or the demonstrations? Yeah, that's the question.
Yeah, thanks for the question. I think I'll mention that we wrote this chapter right before the 2024 Finance Bill protest, but some of what we discuss actually came up during the protests. So as you know, Kenya, there were a lot of protests against a bill that was being proposed. And there were a lot of planners, people planning these different protests in different cities and in different towns. And online, a lot of the organizers were either being located and abducted. There were quite a number of reported abductions related to the protests, where and claims that these abductions were enabled by locating their locations using their phones and being able to track where they were. I think also from the finance bill protest, there was sort of a day where there was an internet shutdown that only affected the major telecoms company in Kenya. And again, a lot of speculation was that the main telecom company was using its power and ability to control internet access to be able to limit the ways in which people are organizing for these protests online. So I'd say definitely there's a lot of evidence and claims, especially online, that these, especially mobile technology, internet interception is being used to locate activists and protesters. Even currently, there are also some protests going on against the current president, and there are claims that mobile interception and internet interception is being used to locate planners and forcefully abduct them, but I have not seen any official reports on that.
Well, thank you very much for a great presentation. I had two questions, especially I think that are more related to the first bit on Kenya. So the first one, because we talk about, you know, how foreign powers or how surveillance has been introduced through colonialism, but now there are new foreign powers like China was mentioned in the case of urban monitoring, if I'm not wrong, in Kenya. So I wanted to learn more about, you know, how do they benefit, what the interest of China in introducing this new age of digital surveillance in these areas. If it could be claimed as a new way of digital colonialism, I think that was mentioned. And the second is probably based on this, what are the challenges and constraints to establish a strong, independent regulatory body?
Mm.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you. I think those are great questions. Absolutely. China has been assessed. There's a lot of work on China as a techno-colonialist in a lot of African countries, especially with regards to investments in CCTV capabilities, data centers in different countries. Yeah, there's a lot that has been written on the role of China. And I think the main concern, which we highlight in our chapter, is that these foreign investments are happening in countries where there is not enough sort of regulation on that limits their involvement. So to what extent can China invest in CCTV surveillance technology, for instance, how much data is still owned in Kenya, how much data is being owned by the foreign country or body that's investing in this technology. I think all those are important questions. And I think it remains to be seen, but definitely China specifically has been investing a lot in CCTV and smart technology, surveillance technology in countries like Kenya. And then in terms of having an independent regulatory body, I think some of the challenges are, that there are conflicting interests, governments, if a government is interested in surveilling and sort of tracking dissent amongst people, they might be opposed to having an independent body that would regulate the ability to have surveillance technology. And I see that as a key sort of barrier to a country like Kenya being able to establish an independent body to surveil, to govern what sort of surveillance technologies are being acquired. But I also do see there's a lot of hope in Kenya. As I mentioned, the civil society space, the high courts have proven that have previously ruled in favor of surveillance technologies and their negative impacts on human rights. So in as much as I'd anticipate there's a lot of pushback from the government in having an independent body to scrutinize what surveillance technology is being acquired, I do think there's hope through the courts that such a body will exist in the future in Kenya specifically.
Can I just say a few words about the China question? So we only conducted research across 5 countries in Africa. In those 5 countries, we found evidence that they had spent $2.7 billion on surveillance technologies in recent years, and that one country, Nigeria, was regularly spending $1 billion per year on surveillance technologies. Given that's only 1/10 of the countries in Africa, that we weren't looking at some of the biggest economies in Africa, there's every reason to think that the real figure is at least 10 times larger, so 20 or 30 US billions. The biggest single ticket item was these safe city public space surveillance systems. And the biggest funder by far of that is China. Not the Chinese state, interestingly, but Chinese banks making available loans of typically $250 million to an African state to buy from private Chinese companies a package of surveillance technologies, which is typically 5,000 or 6,000 CCTV cameras with both facial recognition and car license plate recognition driven by artificial intelligence, and a national data center to centralize all of that data and to process and action it. So $250 million per country for that aid package. And we're now starting a new piece of research, and there'll be a book just on those technologies. But although China is the biggest funder, donor in that space, that's only because China's technology is better and cheaper. So other countries are competing for that space. So in Egypt, the smart city technology comes from Honeywell Bull and other US companies. In some Francophone West African country, the technology comes from Thales and other French surveillance and arms providers. But overall, as in so many other areas of the economy, China is simply providing better and cheaper technology solutions. So it's winning a battle to provide that kind of technology. There's nothing, I would argue, there's nothing essentially Chinese about it. The Americans would love that business, to be supplying all of that technology to all of those countries, but the technology is not as good and much more expensive. Okay, last round of questions or comments.
Apologies if this is the wrong space for this question, but obviously surveillance is a major concern, but I guess with the evolution of AI is how big is the concern that disinformation will become a greater focus of governments along with our surveillance? Yeah, I think that's a question for you both.
Any other questions? Comments? Okay, either of you on disinformation?
All right. Let me speak to this question. With AI, it is obvious that it is transforming how we do stuff. It is affecting everyday life. And with regards to its implications, so far as surveillance is concerned, I always make the argument that AI can be an enabler where it can help in addressing problems in society. So, for instance, maybe they can have they can make provision where if you have suspicion of being under surveillance or something, maybe you can fall on and then you get some education as though you should do it this way or should do it that way or you should do it this way. But that aside, apart from AI being an enabler that can help solve problems, it can also be problems, especially revolving ethical use of AI. It can equally give more power to these agencies who are interested in mounting surveillance, and it can have serious implications so far as human rights or our rights to privacy is concerned. And so the buck stops with, to me, I believe the buck stops with those in power. Using the African context as an example, you realize that when it comes to national security, most of the time, because they have the intention to use it negatively against a citizen, it is not well defined. So if AI is going to enhance how these technologies function when it comes to surveillance, then definitely it is going to give more power to the state security to even take surveillance a notch higher, because AI is enhancing how we are doing stuff. So there is that implication. But like I think the question regarding having independent bodies, if we are able to get independent bodies in existence who can serve as an avenue for accountability and then probity, it will help. But in the African context, like Judy rightly said, the very person who is supposed to set up that independent body is the one doing it. So it's I don't know how to say it, but I see it as a quagmire where everything is tumbling. I don't know. Thank you.
Thanks, Gifty. Yeah, so the book before this was dedicated just to disinformation, and that book has got 10 different chapters from 10 different countries on state disinformation campaigns in those countries. When we wrote that book, AI wasn't really yet on the agenda. You could see it coming, but it wasn't on the agenda. But there's one really interesting app that already uses AI to disseminate disinformation. So the Israeli state has a program of disinformation, or information as it might claim. And it has an app that was called act.li. And that app asked Israelis to give over the control of their social media app, like Facebook, to this app, so that the state could use it to send out disinformation or hasbara. And so what it allows it to do is use AI to listen to social media for keywords, to identify people saying the wrong thing, and then to target them automatically without human intervention with a series of disinformation themes to drown them out, to astroturf. And I personally experienced this very early on after October the 7th, when two friends of mine, two Israeli friends of mine living in Israel, well, one's a friend and one was actually a funder, bizarrely. And so when I was using the banned words of ethnic cleansing and genocide early on after October the 7th, I started getting these messages from my friends, except they weren't coming from them. They were Israeli talking points of disinformation that were triggered by me saying the wrong keyword. And in one case, the person who was a friend, not the funder, she at some point took back control of her own account and apologized and said, I didn't say or mean those things. So it's just one example of what is now not just theoretically, but in practice possible, the automation driven by keywords of profiling plus keyword equals torrent of disinformation. Okay, please join me in thanking our distinguished authors, Judy and Gifty. Thank you for taking the time to share your research with us, and we're looking forward to working with you on new projects in the future. Thank you very much. And thank you all.